Now, contrary to what you may have seen in Finding Nemo, turtle parents don't actually care for their young at all. They give them life and then they leave them to figure it all out for themselves. So the mother turtle will lay their eggs on the shore, buried in the sand. When they hatch, they're on their own. The newborn turtle has got to dig their way out of the sand, risk their way journeying across the beach, risking the predators in the sky, and then when they get into the sea, they've got to try and hide amongst the seaweed in order to escape the larger sea predators as well. So, sea turtles abandon their young. Christians should not be like sea turtles. Though every Christian should have the desire to give birth to new Christians and should be proactively trying to do that, when we do see people coming to faith in Jesus, we shouldn't just abandon them on a beach to fend for themselves, so to speak. We should not merely be interested in getting people to say a prayer and believe in Jesus. Our desire should be that of discipleship, which is the lifelong growth of a person in Jesus, and that takes a long time. You see, becoming a Christian happens in a moment, but Christian growth is a lifelong experience. Becoming a Christian happens the very moment the Spirit of God enters our hearts and brings new life there. And though that happens in a moment, our experience of that may be a gradual dawning of realization of who Jesus is as God's promised deliverer who died to bring us life in himself and bring us to God. So though it happens in a moment, for us it can take days, weeks, months, perhaps even years. And if you've never had that experience, then maybe you're not yet a true Christian. You see, a Christian is not merely someone who has been raised a certain way or who has a vague belief in God, attends church, and accepts that Jesus was an important religious teacher. None of those things make you a Christian. A Christian is someone who's had a conversion experience where they realize that they really are a rebel against God and that Jesus died for them and that he is their only hope, and so their whole life is changed as a result. Now, if you've never experienced that before, why not talk to me about that? I'd love to chat it through with you. I'd love nothing more than to explain to you what it means to be a real Christian. Or why not pray and ask God to show you whether you are a real Christian or not? For many people, coming to faith involves praying and thanking God for Jesus' death, saying sorry for your wrongdoing, asking him for forgiveness, and giving your whole life to following him. But once we have realized that, once we have become a Christian, then begins the life that sometimes wrestles with doubt, takes time to gain knowledge, battles against sin, figures out serving and giving and evangelism, and many other aspects. And all of this can take a very long time. It takes a lifetime. Now, the reason for beginning by talking about this is because as we come to the end of this first journey that Paul and Barnabas are undertaking, as that comes to an end, they don't just leave it at share the gospel and leave. They're not turtles. And from them, we can learn how we are to care for new Christians when we're sharing the gospel with them and when we see them come to faith. How do we care for them? And since we're all in the process ourselves of growing and maturing as Christians, we can learn how we are to grow as well. So 3 things that those who share the gospel are to do. And this is not just evangelists and church planters and missionaries, but something for all Christians and all churches to be involved in one way or another. So the first thing is to prepare converts. So in verse 21, Paul and Barnabas are in Derbe. They share the gospel. People become followers of Jesus. Wonderful. But then they make their return journey back to the places they've already visited, stopping at some new places along the way as well, but ultimately heading back to Antioch in Syria. As they arrive back in Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch in Turkey, they do 2 things. In verse 22, they strengthen the disciples and they encourage them to be faithful. So It says there, they returned to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch, strengthening the disciples and encouraging them to remain true to the faith. You see, being a Christian is not easy. Christians will face hardships, many of which will be the same as everyone else. Health issues, the challenge of work and making ends meet, loss and grief. We're not immune to those things that are common to humanity. We're not promised health, wealth and success just because we become Christians. But being a Christian also has its own unique challenges. Around the world, many Christians face imprisonment and death just for being a Christian. Here in the UK, we might have people ridicule us or despise us. But then there are other challenges of simply living the Christian life. The person who isn't a Christian might think it right to be moral or might not care. A non-Christian might show compassion for the needy and concern for the natural world, or they might not. But the Christian has no choice in this. To follow the way that Christ has called us to live is what we have to do. And that requires us to think carefully about morality, the needy, the natural world, and many other things. And it requires us to respond sacrificially, which is not easy. Now, we've been wondering about buying a caravan recently, and so we went to look at a second-hand one the other day just to help us make up our own minds. The guy selling the caravan, he would never make it very far in the sales industry because he was far too honest. He was telling us about all the faults that the caravan had, as well as telling us about the good points, of course, as well. But when we're sharing the gospel with people, it would be all too easy only to tell people about the benefits. And of course we should tell them about the benefits, about all that Jesus has done for us, about how he forgives us and gives us hope of eternal life and all of these things. But we also need to be upfront in telling people who will follow him that they will endure suffering and hardship as a result of following him. That's exactly what Jesus did. And we must follow his example in that. So we shouldn't hide the hardships that Christians will face. We shouldn't overpromise and say your life will be easy once you become a Christian. But we should be realistic and explain that there will be hard times in the Christian faith. Well, Paul and Barnabas, they share with their words that we must go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God. As much as our final destination is a place of eternal happiness and pleasure in God in the new heavens and earth, that kingdom, the path to it, is a very narrow path with struggle along the way. Now, if you had been told when you became a Christian that your life will be perfect and plain sailing, what are you going to do when the diagnosis comes in? Or when that letter with bad news comes through the door? Or when someone says to you that they want nothing to do with you now because of your faith? If you've been told it's supposed to be easy, then when it gets hard, you're more likely to give up. But if you've been prepared, even before you become a Christian, that when you do there will be hardships along the way, then you'll be ready to tackle those times, with the help of God and with the help of other Christians, of course. Well, the second thing we're to be involved in is to establish churches. Now, this, you might think, is the job of church planters and church leaders, but the Bible gives a lot of responsibility to all of the people who belong to the local church. So this, in many ways, is for all of us, not just for the Pauls and Barnabases who get churches started in the first place. So after they've encouraged the believers in the town to keep going, even though they're going to face hardships, then they establish the churches in these areas. And that's indicated by them appointing elders and then releasing them to be independent churches. Now, what we're looking at here is how a group of new converts in a particular area become an established church. Church planting, as many people refer to it today. But that doesn't mean there aren't important lessons for us as a church that has been established for over 200 years. You see, the work of establishing a church is an ongoing process. Like how a mature garden needs constant care and attention to ensure it remains healthy and beautiful and weed-free, so even an established church needs constant care and attention to ensure it remains an established church. Well, verse 23 is where we're looking at, and that gives us two aspects of what it means to be a truly established church. So Paul and Barnabas appointed elders for them in each church, and with prayer and fasting committed them to the Lord in whom they had put their trust. So the first aspect is that they are led by elders, that elders are appointed in the churches. And that's not just one elder in each church. That might be the case as a necessary measure for a church, but it's certainly not the ideal. The ideal is that there will be multiple godly, mature Christians in a local church who are able to take responsibility and able to lead the church forward. Now, the word elder, it indicates that they are people who are able to make decisions and give wise direction to a church, to lead a church forward. Although it could refer to someone who was older in age, it came to refer as a title to someone who was mature in character rather than in mere age. And so these are people who have a stable faith and a good basis of knowledge from which to pull from. But what is interesting is that they can't have been Christians for all that long. The first journey that Paul and Barnabas have been on, that we've been looking at throughout the past few weeks, it would have lasted around 2 or 3 years. So these would have been young Christians, people who had been Christians for only 2 or 3 years. But they would have no doubt demonstrated a very quick sense of progress in the faith, a character that exudes godliness and an aptitude for grasping the teaching of the Bible. So the first aspect of an established church, as from what we see here at least, is to be led by elders. The second aspect is independency. That is, that Paul and Barnabas were able to release the churches to make their own way as they were committed to the Lord, as it says there. So these two apostles, they didn't continue to exert an authoritarian oversight over these local churches. They didn't hold a position as regional bishops, but they empowered the churches to make their own way in the spiritual world, shall we say. So whilst we're not supposed to be turtles and abandon people, we're also not to go down the opposite route, the other extreme of being overbearing mothers who never let their children off the leash to make their own decision and their own mistakes and their own progress in the world. So why do we need to know this? Well, it's because every person who is part of the church should be responsible for establishing the church. For those of you who are part of our church, we are responsible for ensuring our church remains an established and healthy church. So when it comes to eldership, that means that we together are to be those who identify and encourage and recognise those who show themselves to have godly character, integrity, wisdom and insight. And then it means submitting to those who lead, who have been put in positions of leadership in the church, recognising that they are the gifts of Jesus to his bride. When it comes to independency, it means being committed to the church first and foremost, rather than giving equal importance to any influence of other churches or Christian speakers or authors or whatever else. It means being committed to what we as a church have decided are the ways that we will do church, rather than comparing us to what other churches are doing down the road or in the neighbouring town, or trying to pull in a direction of what other churches are doing. It means doing what we can to maintain our own financial independency through prioritising your giving to the local church over and above any Christian mission or organisation or charitable work. By all means, we can listen to other preachers, read other people's books. We can take a keen interest in what works for other churches. We can give to people working overseas with other organisations. But our priority should be this local church, the church that God has set you to be within. So one question that essentially sums this up, one question that is worth asking. Are you more concerned with investing and contributing to the church, or are you more concerned with what a church can do for you, for your needs and for your wants? It's a very searching question, and for many of you, it's very evident that you are concerned with establishing the church, and that is great, fantastic. There's so much more we could say on this, but for time we must move on. We prepare converts, we establish churches, and finally we maintain contact. So quite simply, Paul and Barnabas, they eventually make it back to Antioch in Syria, and when they do make it back there, they call the whole church together to share the news of what's been going on. This church has sent them on their mission, and so they would naturally be keen to hear how God has been at work. Now, there's a very obvious way that we are to apply this. When we send people out on some kind of mission, we ought to take every opportunity to hear from them when they come back. And not merely in terms of their cultural experience of the food and the language and so on, but as Paul and Barnabas do in verse 27. It says, on arriving there, they gathered the church together and reported all that God had done through them and how he had opened up a door of faith to the Gentiles. If we send people out to do God's work, if we've invested in them or if we've invested in other people, we want to hear what God has done through them. Who has heard the gospel? Who has responded to the message? Who has God saved? So we need to make sure we maintain contact with people who have been sent out, people who are out on mission that we've committed to supporting, especially when they come from our own church, especially when we've committed to supporting them. But there's another way that I briefly want to apply this, and that is to say that there are no Lone Ranger Christians. Christians thrive in churches as fish thrive in water. It's the local church that sends out the people on mission in the first place. And while they're on mission, they're concerned to get new disciples established in new churches as quickly as possible. And then they return to their local church to report on how it's gone. There's a level of contact and accountability to the local church, even for the person who is sent out on mission. Now, obviously, if you're part of our church, then, as we've been saying, this is where you are to be invested. So as you go out on mission every single week into the workplace, into your neighbourhood, into your family, you're part of us. And we together want to know how it's going with each of us on mission. We ought to be praying for each other and supporting our efforts, as we do try to do. But maybe you're listening online and you're not part of a local church. Well, it's the biblical pattern to be part of a local church. It's not healthy to be out on your own. It removes all accountability and support. And if that's you, then wherever you are located, find a local church that you belong to, that you can belong to. If you're around Cwmbran, then you're welcome to make contact with us and to make us your home. If you want to know of local churches in your own area, then I'd be very happy to help you find a local church. Just get in touch with us and we'd love to help you as, say, a fish getting into your natural environment of water. So to give birth to a new Christian is a wonderful experience. It's a real joy and privilege. Many of you know this experience where there is someone that you've shared the good news with over time and you've prayed with them in order to bring them to faith in Christ. It's an amazing experience. It's something we all ought to be pursuing actively. And if we ever do have that experience, well, what follows is not to abandon them. As much as possible, wherever we're able to, we nurture them. We prepare them for the hardships that they will face. We establish them in local churches. And we do that ourselves as people who are invested in our own local church, where we are accountable and supported by other Christians. May God have the glory as he works in us and through us.